August 30th, 1945. The thoroughfares of Tokyo were anything but thoroughfares. They were transformed into solidified rivers of ash, brittle crusts punctuated by the skeletal remains of residences that once resonated with joyous sounds. In the distance, the imperial palace stood like a lingering memory, its moats mirroring a sky devoid of any celebratory hue. On this particular day, a mere fortnight after Emperor Hirohito's radio address announcing the nation's capitulation, the very first American military footwear made contact with the soil of the capital. For a considerable portion of Japan's civilian populace, this arrival was anticipated as the harbinger of deep humiliation, outright violence, or perhaps something even more dreadful. After all, for many years, children had been regaled with bedtime narratives not of benevolent spirits, but of Americans intent on their merciless slaughter. Yet, as the jeeps advanced through the smoke-laden atmosphere, the initial spectacle was not of malevolent entities, but of sun-kissed men, their bodies slick with sweat beneath khaki uniforms, fanning themselves awkwardly with their helmets. Their pockets overflowed with objects that shimmered like precious finds: chocolate bars, sealed tins of Spam, and packs of chewing gum. The profound astonishment began subtly, almost imperceptibly. It was the children who first registered the anomaly. Barefoot, their eyes hollow, some clad in garments fashioned from discarded futons, they observed from the shadows of alleyways where the wind whipped dust into their hair. Their mothers, gripped by apprehension, pulled them back. Elderly men grumbled under their breath about dishonor, about the ignominy of witnessing enemy soldiers traverse the heart of their empire unopposed. However, the gnawing pangs of hunger eclipsed their fear, and eyes that had been schooled solely in animosity now studied the distended satchels of the American soldiers with a curiosity that far outweighed their suspicion. One young lad, his ribs starkly visible beneath a threadbare cotton shirt, summoned the courage to whisper to his sister, "Do you suppose they truly consume all of that?" The stark reality was that the populace braced for the worst. Dating back to 1937, Japan's state-controlled media had systematically portrayed Americans as savage brutes. Propaganda posters depicted American servicemen as demon-like figures with horns, their mouths bared with knives clenched between their teeth. Mothers had instilled in their offspring the conviction that capture by Americans signified inevitable demise. Even in the final throes of the conflict, rumors propagated with alarming rapidity. Tales circulated of Americans intent on poisoning wells, enslaving entire families, and desecrating every temple and shrine. Nevertheless, what advanced into the city was remarkably mundane. Not legions of devils or conquering hordes wielding flaming torches, but weary young men, some barely older than the children who watched them, their rifles slung casually, exchanging awkward glances at the widespread desolation before them. One soldier meticulously recorded in his journal on that momentous day, "Tokyo presents a landscape akin to the moon. I had anticipated being met with hatred, perhaps even death. Instead, they merely gaze at us. Children are everywhere, far too many children and far too hungry." Indeed, hunger was the pivotal axis around which this unprecedented encounter revolved. By the latter part of 1945, daily caloric intake had plummeted to below 1,500 per individual. Rice, the fundamental staple of the Japanese diet, was in desperately short supply. People resorted to scavenging for weeds, acorns, and even sawdust to supplement their meager meals. Children collapsed in classrooms due to sheer weakness. Malnutrition had stunted their growth. Informal marketplaces proliferated in alleyways like fungi. Yet, only those with established connections could engage in trade. For everyone else, each day was an agonizing negotiation with emptiness. When the Americans materialized, it was as if mobile warehouses brimming with abundance had inexplicably stumbled into a barren wasteland. And then, the unthinkable occurred. Instead of issuing barked commands or seizing possessions, a young American private, his helmet perched precariously far too large for his head, halted his jeep, knelt down, and extended a chocolate bar to a small girl clutching a broken doll. The girl's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in disbelief. She had been conditioned to believe these men would target children first. Instead, she witnessed her daughter embrace the bar, as if it were a sacred artifact, inhaling its sweet, unfamiliar aroma before tentatively taking a small bite. Her eyes widened. She had never experienced such a flavor. Her giggle, light and tinged with nervousness, carried across the hushed street. That singular moment spread like wildfire through hushed conversations. American soldiers were distributing food, not pilfering it, nor hoarding it, but pressing cans and bars into the open hands of children. Soon, other GIs emulated this act of generosity. Powdered milk was ladled into chipped bowls. Chewing gum was unwrapped for small, eager mouths. Spam, though its preparation remained a mystery to most, was sliced and distributed. The pervasive atmosphere of dread began to fracture, replaced by a stunned sense of incredulity. Mothers wept silently, torn between profound gratitude and searing shame. Fathers turned their faces away, mortified that the sustenance of their families might now depend on the benevolence of their adversaries. But the children, ever the truest indicators of reality, did not hesitate. They ate. They chewed gum until it adhered to their hair. They licked chocolate from their fingers, their wide eyes reflecting a sweetness previously unknown. For them, ideological indoctrination melted away far more rapidly than sugar on the tongue. The soldiers chuckled softly, perhaps relieved to discover that nourishing children was a far simpler endeavor than confronting opposing combatants on a battlefield. And in that fragile mirth, something irrevocably shifted. Of course, this tableau was not universally observed. Within the same metropolis, voices of bitter resentment still lingered. "Shameful," an elder muttered as he observed his neighbor's son gleefully clutching a Hershey bar. "We prostrate ourselves before them now, even for a morsel of food." Yet even he could not completely disregard the luminescence on the child's face. Hunger is an unforgiving educator, and it imparts pragmatism with far greater speed than it instills pride. For the American contingent, this gesture was partly instinctive, partly a matter of operational policy. Formalized relief initiatives, overseen by General MacArthur's Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, would require considerable time to implement. Shipments of wheat and powdered milk were not anticipated to arrive in substantial quantities for several months. However, the soldiers themselves were equipped with their own rations, and they were acutely aware of the hungry children. It was demonstrably easier to distribute sustenance than to articulate the complexities of military occupation. It was simpler to elicit a smile than to manage an unnerving silence. Perhaps, too, it served as a means to reaffirm their own inherent humanity after years of conflict. The civilian population remained unaware at that juncture, but this seemingly minor act would reverberate outwards. What commenced as isolated instances of distributing chocolate and gum would ultimately evolve into organized food aid, the establishment of school lunch programs, and a fundamental reorientation of daily Japanese dietary habits. Nevertheless, in that precise moment, no one contemplated policy. Their thoughts were solely occupied by the overwhelming reality of hunger and the truly unimaginable, an enemy force bending low to provide sustenance to a child. By the time dusk settled over the city that day, word had permeated the ravaged streets of Tokyo. The Americans had not arrived solely armed with weapons. They had arrived bearing provisions. Children relayed the news to other children. Mothers shared whispered accounts with their neighbors. The pervasive fear did not vanish entirely, but its formidable grip began to loosen. And through that widening breach, something seeped into Japan that had been absent for months, perhaps even years. Not trust, not yet, but a nascent curiosity. As the sun dipped below the fractured skyline, an American jeep came to a halt near a small, still-standing shrine. Its roof partially collapsed from firebombing. A soldier disembarked, a tin of milk powder in his hand. Dozens of children surrounded him, their eyes wide, not with terror, but with eager anticipation. He offered a smile, albeit an awkward one, and extended the can. Somewhere in the vicinity, a bell tolled with a solemn and peculiar resonance. In that sound resided the weight of surrender, the ache of profound hunger, and the faintest whisper of something almost beyond conception, that an empire brought to its knees might discover its initial taste of recovery, not through triumph or retribution, but through a mere spoonful of foreign nourishment. And what those children were soon to discover was that this was merely the nascent stage. the taste of chocolate was not merely a sensation of sweetness. For a great many Japanese children in 1945, it represented the inaugural instance where they began to grasp the possibility that life might indeed unfold differently from the narratives they had been fed. In the narrow, winding lanes of Osaka, where plumes of smoke still curled from bomb-scarred walls, a young boy named Haruo sat on a step, clutching a square of Hershey's chocolate. He had been indoctrinated with the belief that Americans were merciless monsters, yet the square melted on his tongue with a flavor that utterly contradicted the word enemy. His mother, observing from the shadows, clenched her fists. Gratitude was intertwined with shame, and shame was inextricably linked to survival. In this complex tension, the entire nation found its reflection. Food inadvertently became the very arena where perceptions clashed. The Americans, for their part, were equipped with rations filled with unfamiliar items: tinned Spam, glistening pink and slick, powdered milk sealed in cylindrical containers, and chewing gum, which bewildered elderly women who believed it was meant to be ingested whole. To the famished civilians, these provisions appeared almost ethereal, like mythical treasures. To the soldiers, they were commonplace, even disposable. This stark disparity in meaning generated a silent, compelling drama on the streets of Japan. Soldiers distributed these goods with the casualness of men who possessed in abundance. Civilians accepted them with the profound reverence of those who possessed nothing. The contrast was most striking when observed in the visages of the children. Oral histories recount the tale of one girl, scarcely 8 years of age, who accepted a piece of gum from a Marine and held it aloft, as if it were a precious jewel. She chewed until the sweetness dissipated, then carefully tucked the wad behind her ear for safekeeping, returning to it later as though it were solid gold. Such anecdotal instances spread through whispered conversations, gradually softening the deeply ingrained images that propaganda had etched into public consciousness. "They are not monsters," one boy confided to his sister. "Monsters do not offer candy." The stark statistics underscore the depth of their desperation. By the close of 1945, Japan was importing less than half the quantity of food it had consumed prior to the war. The average daily calorie intake for civilians had fallen below subsistence levels. Adults experienced fainting spells at their places of work. Children's bellies distended with hunger. While relief shipments under SCAP began to arrive, their distribution was a protracted process. During this interim period, the sight of GIs dispensing their personal rations carried a significance far exceeding the intrinsic value of the items themselves. In urban centers such as Yokohama and Nagoya, rudimentary soup kitchens emerged, where powdered milk was whisked into steaming bowls and poured into hands cupped with chipped porcelain. Some children recoiled at the unfamiliar taste, yet they drank it nonetheless, the warmth providing solace to stomachs long accustomed to the void. However, acceptance was a complex emotion. Parents stood at a distance, their faces etched with disquiet. To accept sustenance from the enemy was to implicitly acknowledge dependency. One mother from Osaka later recalled, "I wept when my son drank the milk. My desire for him to live warred with the sensation of our pride dissolving." Pride was a fragile commodity during those months, and every act of relief threatened to shatter it further. Nevertheless, the gnawing reality of starvation compelled difficult choices. Children harbored fewer reservations, and in their palpable eagerness, the fissures of reconciliation began to widen. American soldiers, too, grappled with the profound strangeness of the situation. One GI, interviewed decades later, reminisced about the weight of a boy's gaze as he handed him a can of Spam. "He looked at me as if I were bestowing upon him the entire world," the soldier recounted. "Back home, Spam was a joke, but there, it was a treasure. I believe that's when I truly grasped the magnitude of what we had inflicted upon this country." The irony was palpable. Food derided as low-quality fare back in the United States had transformed into a profound symbol of compassion in occupied Japan. Moments of unexpected humor punctuated the gravity of the circumstances. In one Tokyo neighborhood, a grandmother, assuming the Spam was raw pork, boiled it for hours, only to lament that it had disintegrated into an unappetizing mush. Another family attempted to fry powdered milk into patties, only to scrape the burnt remnants from their pan with immense disappointment. Such anecdotes, though seemingly minor, illuminate the awkward convergence of two vastly different worlds. The gifts bestowed were not merely sustenance. They represented profound cultural exchanges. They were moments where misunderstandings gave way to laughter or frustration, but invariably left an indelible trace of human connection. Testimonies from children recounting those years remain remarkably vivid. One boy recollected the sheer shock of tasting genuine sugar for the very first time, his tongue momentarily overwhelmed by the sudden, intense sweetness. A girl remembered clutching her first candy bar tightly, hesitant to consume it, fearful that its pleasure would vanish too quickly. When she finally took a bite, she described the experience as akin to eating light. To them, these were not merely transient treats. They were tangible evidence that the enemy possessed something far beyond incendiary devices. Yet, the central conflict persisted. How could a nation reconcile the imagery of annihilation with gestures of genuine kindness? The cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remained wounds so raw that survivors flinched at the sight of any American countenance. The ruins of Tokyo whispered of the devastating firebombing in March, when over 100,000 lives had been extinguished in a single night. To accept chocolate from the very hands that had unleashed napalm was an act almost beyond comprehension, and yet it transpired. Every morsel contained a profound paradox. Bitterness and sweetness became inextricably intertwined. By the close of autumn, these informal distributions began to find echoes in official relief efforts. In schools, teachers systematically lined up children for steaming ladles of soup thickened with American wheat. Laughter, long absent, began to re-emerge in courtyards where silence had reigned supreme. Nevertheless, some children found themselves remembering the sting of shame more vividly than the sweetness of the taste. One boy recalled concealing his chocolate bar beneath his shirt to prevent anyone from witnessing him consume it. Another confessed that he ate with his back turned to his mother, too mortified to allow her to observe his evident pleasure. For the soldiers, these moments offered a different form of solace, or perhaps they had merely served to harden them, to strip them of their innocence. To kneel before children and offer them food was, in a sense, to reclaim something they feared had been irrevocably lost. One Marine confessed, "I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't just a killer. The chocolate, the milk, the gum, these were not merely provisions. They were potent symbols, not only for the Japanese populace but for the Americans themselves, serving as markers of their enduring humanity amidst the devastating wreckage of war." Despite these acts, the chasm between mere gesture and genuine trust remained vast. Many civilians voiced their suspicions aloud, questioning whether these gifts were merely stratagems, designed to lull them into a false sense of security before a resurgence of cruelty. Others voiced concerns about potential poison hidden within the powdered milk. Distrust lingered, as deeply entrenched as the pervasive hunger. And yet, as days gradually morphed into weeks, the bestowal of these gifts continued, a steady, unthreatening presence, until doubt began its slow erosion. Children who had once instinctively recoiled at the sight of soldiers now actively pursued their jeeps, waving enthusiastically for candy. Soldiers, once perceived as instruments of destruction, transformed into purveyors of peculiar delicacies. The paradox was almost too profound to fully comprehend. Amidst the shattered remnants of a war that had torn families asunder and reduced cities to mere piles of ash, a single square of chocolate or a modest spoonful of milk transcended its physical form. They became powerful emblems of survival, tangible gestures that compelled both sides to perceive each other through an entirely new lens. The Japanese people came to understand that the enemy possessed hands capable of nourishing, as well as fists capable of striking. The Americans discovered that the ultimate victory was not solely defined by conquest, but by the fragile yet profoundly significant act of assisting the vanquished to simply endure another day. By the winter of 1945, these whispered accounts had coalesced into a cautious yet undeniable acknowledgement. The Americans were not solely an occupying force. They had, in a peculiar way, become providers. And though the lingering bitterness of loss persisted like a stubborn plume of smoke, the sweetness of chocolate had begun to contend with it in their memories. Yet, what those families had yet to fully comprehend was that these seemingly small gestures were merely the nascent beginnings of a much larger narrative. Food was poised to transform into an instrument of peace, wielded not upon the desolate battlefields of the past, but within the vibrant confines of schoolyards and the intimate settings of kitchens, fundamentally reshaping the future of a nation, one meal at a time. The ruins of Japan were not exclusively physical manifestations. They were deeply emotional landscapes, as thoroughly crumbled as the brick and timber that constituted its once proud cities. Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Yokohama, Osaka, all bore indelible scars that could not be simply swept clean with the changing seasons. In the concluding months of 1945, close to 9 million individuals were rendered homeless, compelled to reside in makeshift shelters constructed from corrugated tin, tarpaulins, and salvaged wooden boards. The biting winter wind pierced through walls that offered little to no protection. Children endured empty stomachs as they slept, while adults valiantly fought off the debilitating weakness of malnutrition that dulled both their bodies and their spirits. Into this landscape of utter devastation emerged the occupying force, their uniforms impeccably pressed, their jeeps in pristine condition, and their supplies seemingly inexhaustible. This stark contrast was palpable and registered by everyone present. General Douglas MacArthur, the pivotal figure presiding over occupation policy, adamantly insisted in his initial directives that the specter of famine must be averted at all conceivable costs. He fully understood the reality his men were witnessing firsthand. He recognized that starving populations could not be effectively governed. "Provide them with sustenance," he articulated in his official dispatches, "and we shall earn far more than mere obedience. We shall earn an opportunity for lasting peace." His words translated into tangible actions. American wheat began to arrive by the ton. Vast quantities of milk powder were meticulously stacked in designated warehouses, and comprehensive plans were laid for the implementation of school lunch programs designed to reach millions of children. Relief organizations actively joined the endeavor. Organizations such as CARE, the Red Cross, and various church missions diligently funneled essential calories into a country where mere survival had devolved into a relentless daily negotiation. However, these grand statistical figures only conveyed a partial narrative. On the ground, the interactions were profoundly human, often awkward and frequently tinged with a complex mixture of pride and shame. A father residing in Yokohama found himself standing in line at a soup kitchen where American flour had been painstakingly baked into rough loaves of bread. He carefully tore off a piece for his son, but when the boy inquired, "Will you eat too?" the father simply shook his head and offered a gentle smile. Later, in an oral history interview, that same boy recalled, "I realized then that my father had not eaten for days." Survival was not merely measured in caloric intake. It was also gauged by the silent sacrifices made. The humiliation of dependency weighed heavily on many. Men who had once marched with unwavering loyalty for the empire now found themselves queuing behind their own children, bowls clutched in their hands. One such individual recalled his profound unease. "I fought against them in the Pacific," he recounted, "and now I accept bread from them. It feels like a defeat, compounded. Pride, though severely tested, stubbornly resisted complete capitulation under the relentless pressure of hunger." In numerous neighborhoods, parents explicitly forbade their children from displaying excessive eagerness when receiving food, fearing it might portray them as desperate beggars. The children outwardly complied, but their eyes betrayed their true longing. American soldiers, meanwhile, found themselves entangled in their own internal conflicts. Some had participated in brutal combat, having witnessed friends fall to Japanese gunfire. Now, they were ladling soup or distributing candy to the very children of those same adversaries. A Marine who had survived the harrowing Battle of Iwo Jima wrote to his wife, "It's the most peculiar thing. I genuinely believed I would never look at a child without harboring hatred. But today, I handed a chocolate bar to a little girl. She responded with a deep bow. I no longer know what to feel." These acts of feeding evolved into a peculiar form of reconciliation, not solely for the civilian population, but for the occupying soldiers themselves. They offered a chance to reclaim a sense of humanity that the war had seemingly scoured from them. The statistics remain nothing short of staggering. By 1946, over 870,000 tons of food had been imported into Japan through American aid programs. School lunch initiatives, initially introduced in Tokyo and subsequently disseminated nationwide, had reached millions of children by 1947. These programs not only provided essential calories, but also instilled a crucial sense of stability, enabling educational institutions to resume their operations, even within structures that were little more than patched-up ruins. Children who had once fainted in class due to sheer hunger now patiently lined up for bowls of stew and rolls of bread. For them, sustenance became inextricably linked with the very process of learning. Survival became entwined with their future prospects. Yet, even as these compassionate gestures offered solace, they also served to deepen existing contradictions. Civilians harbored vivid memories of the fire bombings that had annihilated entire neighborhoods. They remembered Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the very shadows burned into stone served as stark testaments to lives extinguished in an instant. How could the same hands that had unleashed fire from the heavens now serve bread and milk? This question haunted the adult population, far more so than the children, but it lingered with every bite consumed. One survivor of the Tokyo firebombing recalled, "When my daughter ate American bread, I experienced a profound duality of relief and anger. They incinerated my home. Now they feed her. Is this their true nature?" The Americans themselves frequently encountered cultural misunderstandings. Spam baffled households, its origin and preparation unknown. Wheat felt alien and unfamiliar compared to the deeply ingrained familiarity of rice, and powdered milk left aftertastes that children found decidedly peculiar. Still, the overwhelming force of hunger rendered even the strangest provisions welcome, and over time, adaptations inevitably occurred. Wheat was ingeniously transformed into noodles and bread into sandwiches, foods that would eventually become fundamental staples of a modern Japanese diet. In this manner, necessity served as the ultimate catalyst for cultural transformation. Each shared meal represented a quiet, nuanced negotiation between the nation's past identity and its present imperative for survival. Humor subtly threaded its way through this profound transformation. In Osaka, children discovered the peculiar novelty of bubblegum and promptly affixed it to their foreheads, seemingly under the impression it was a form of decoration. In Tokyo, a grandmother mistook cocoa powder for garden fertilizer and liberally spread it across her flower beds, later expressing bewilderment as to why it possessed such a sweet aroma. These minor missteps, recalled with fond laughter years later, served to soften edges that might otherwise have inflicted deeper emotional wounds. They provided compelling proof that even amidst utter devastation, individuals could stumble upon moments of unexpected levity. They were a testament to the stubborn, persistent forward momentum of life itself. This process of reconciliation was neither instantaneous nor absolute. Distrust persisted, whispered through the shadowy confines of alleys. The prevailing sentiment was articulated as, "They provide food today, but what about tomorrow?" Yet the steady supply of sustenance, the daily consistency of assistance, gradually fostered a resilience far more substantial than mere whispers. With the passage of time, the act of consuming unfamiliar provisions transformed from an acknowledgement of defeat into a ritual of enduring existence. Families found another dawn. Youngsters matured. Educational institutions once again buzzed with the dissemination of knowledge. Within this recurring cadence, the perception of Americans evolved from adversaries to complex benefactors. A young individual who had been an adolescent in 1945 later recounted this metamorphosis. "Initially, I found the bread utterly detestable. I loathed the implication that our survival hinged upon their generosity. However, the pangs of emptiness were an even greater torment. Consequently, I gradually realized I began to anticipate its arrival. This realization perplexed me. How could one simultaneously detest and require the very same entity?" His sentiments perfectly encapsulate the inherent contradiction of that era, the internal struggle that characterized Japan in the aftermath of the conflict. To vehemently reject dependence on one's vanquisher, yet to perceive within their offerings the potential for continued life and even optimism. As the initial full winter following the capitulation descended upon the islands, a thick blanket of snow covered the devastated landscapes, and the biting cold intensified the widespread hunger. While relief shipments augmented, so too did the pervasive sense of desperation. Small fires were kindled in makeshift shelters constructed from salvaged metal, Empty vessels were passed from one person to another. Service members and civilians encountered each other, separated by the vast chasm of linguistic differences and profound loss. Each interaction held a significance that transcended the physical sustenance provided. It served as a test of whether former adversaries could coexist within the precarious present. Amidst the devastation, a novel narrative began to take root. One where communal meals supplanted weaponry and school-provided nourishment replaced the imagery of combat zones. Nevertheless, the underlying tension persisted, unresolved, as though each mouthful carried a dual burden of gratitude and sorrow. The Japanese populace was commencing to view their conquerors as beings of greater complexity than mere villains. Simultaneously, the Americans were discovering that peace could not be solely imposed through military might. However, the most profound shift was yet to manifest, a transformation that would elevate these isolated gestures into something enduring, fundamentally altering not only dietary habits, but also ingrained perceptions. For in the years that followed, sustenance would evolve from mere relief into a cornerstone of mutual trust, forging an unexpected connection between conqueror and subjugated. By 1947, the rhythm of aid had become an ingrained routine. Vessels unloaded substantial quantities of wheat and considerable volumes of powdered milk at Japanese harbors, and robust vehicles traversed neighborhoods reduced to rubble, distributing provisions that had previously been considered unattainable luxuries. For the children who had known nothing but scarcity, the distinct sound of a ladle striking the bottom of a pot in a schoolyard resonated with a comfort akin to the melodic chime of temple bells in bygone days. They patiently queued with dented containers and wooden utensils, their exhaled breaths forming ephemeral clouds in the frigid air, their animated chatter echoing against walls reassembled from salvaged debris. Each serving contained more than just a simple broth. It carried the implicit assurance that the succeeding day might offer a departure from the hardships of the preceding one. The school meal initiative rapidly evolved into an essential lifeline. By 1948, an astounding 4 million Japanese children were being provided with daily sustenance through a collaborative effort involving American assistance and Japanese organizational capacity. Crusty wheat rolls superseded traditional rice balls, milk was dispensed piping hot, and dishes prepared with surplus. American ingredients became indelible markers of childhood experiences. In the initial stages, educators found it necessary to encourage the children to partake in bread, a flavor entirely alien to a culture deeply rooted in rice consumption. Nevertheless, the relentless pangs of hunger proved to be a compelling motivator, and within a few short years, the children were eagerly requesting additional portions. Some would later recount with amusement how their newfound affection for noodles, curries, and bread, items now intrinsically woven into the fabric of Japanese culinary tradition, originated from those post-war repasts. Amidst these established routines, interpersonal bonds began to deepen. Civilians who had previously averted direct eye contact with American servicemen started to exchange subtle nods, then tentative conversations, and eventually hesitant bursts of laughter. Youngsters would trail military vehicles, not out of apprehension, but with a sense of eager anticipation, waving enthusiastically and calling out for confectionery. Written expressions of gratitude, painstakingly inscribed in hesitant hiragana script, were delivered to the headquarters of the Occupation Administration. One particular note, penned by a young boy from Tokyo, conveyed a simple yet profound sentiment. Dear soldier, thank you for the bread. I will dedicate myself to my studies so that I may become strong. The soldier who received this message preserved it, carefully folded within his wallet for the remainder of his life. This outcome was not what either party had anticipated. The Americans had prepared themselves for outright hostility, possibly even sustained guerrilla insurgency. The Japanese populace had braced for profound cruelty, perhaps even systematic subjugation. Instead, what emerged was something far more unexpected, a shared act of compassion extending across the devastation wrought by conflict. This did not serve to erase the lingering trauma of the incendiary raids or the spectral silhouettes imprinted on walls by the atomic detonations, but it undeniably introduced a new dimension to the narrative, one where the adversary was no longer solely perceived as an agent of destruction, but also as a provider. This inherent contradiction became the fertile ground for a nascent and precarious trust. Nevertheless, the establishment of trust was never a straightforward endeavor. Older generations frequently resisted its embrace, clinging steadfastly to their grief, which could not be easily assuaged by the provision of bread. Mothers sometimes murmured that sustenance originating from the enemy was akin to a bitter medicinal draught. Fathers cautioned their offspring against developing excessive fondness for these foreign individuals. However, the younger generation was already undergoing a palpable transformation. They would erupt in peals of laughter as they manipulated chewing gum into ephemeral bubbles. They would hum melodies while tightly clutching loaves of bread. They would whisper tales of soldiers who offered smiles rather than stern commands. For them, the concept of America had transcended its association with catastrophic aerial bombardments. It now also encompassed the sweet sensation of chocolate resting in the palm of their hands. Unforeseen and subtle instances of humor began to soften the harsh realities. Children would describe peanut butter as a sticky candy paste, marveling at its unusual sweet and salty combination. Grandmothers, in a gesture of ingrained tradition, would attempt to consume bread using chopsticks. Soldiers would observe with amusement as children bartered their sweets for simple marbles, thus improvising novel economies of joy in the shadowed alleyways. These seemingly insignificant moments gradually coalesced into the very threads of connection, binding together two populations who had previously known each other only through the grim lens of warfare. The broader transformation was fundamentally ideological. The American occupation, under the strategic guidance of General MacArthur's command, extended beyond mere military control to encompass significant cultural influence. Food emerged as its most compelling instrument, not employed through coercion, but extended through open gestures of goodwill. Adequate nutrition facilitated the functioning of educational institutions. The effective operation of schools, in turn, allowed for the freer circulation of ideas. And incrementally, a vanquished nation began the arduous process of reconstruction, laying its foundations as much upon the provision of meals as upon the implementation of new policies. Japan's post-war democratic system, initially fragile, gradually acquired greater fortitude, nurtured by the daily acts of nourishment that sustained its populace. After all, the basic needs of sustenance often serve as the most persuasive educators. Personal accounts serve as poignant evidence of the profound emotional impact of this shift. A resident of Nagoya recounted, "When my son returned home with a piece of bread from school, I held it as if it were a priceless artifact. It was foreign, unfamiliar, and yet it represented life itself. It was then that I harbored the hope that perhaps we would not cease to exist." Another individual from Hiroshima articulated the stark irony of the situation. "The very same America that had annihilated my city provided my daughter with milk. She consumed it daily. She grew tall, surpassing any height I had ever imagined possible. While I could not fully forgive, I could not deny the undeniable truth represented by that milk." These individual narratives vividly capture the inherent paradox, a process of reconciliation born not from oblivion, but from the unyielding persistence of the will to survive. The Americans, too, carried with them the enduring memories of this unexpected exchange. Decades later, veterans who had served during the occupation often spoke not of military engagements, but of the children they had encountered. One recalled, "I can still clearly envision their faces when we distributed soup to them. They expressed their gratitude with such profound politeness, despite their extreme hunger. That experience affected me more deeply than any combat ever had. For soldiers who had been hardened by years of relentless warfare, the simple act of distributing food offered a pathway back to their own inherent humanity, a tangible confirmation that victory did not necessitate the perpetration of cruelty. The ultimate outcome was not an instantaneous blossoming of amity, but a gradual interwovenness of lives that had been previously rent asunder. The act of providing sustenance created shared spaces where linguistic barriers began to dissolve, replaced by the universal language of smiles. In the marketplaces, meticulously rebuilt from the remnants of devastation, American flour was readily available, displayed alongside locally sourced Japanese vegetables. Within the confines of classrooms, children diligently recited lessons on democratic principles between bites of their bread. The occupation, by its very nature, remained a period marked by significant power disparities and underlying currents of suppressed resentment. However, beneath this veneer pulsed the undeniable rhythm of shared meals, a force that could not be disregarded. And within this rhythm lay the nascent potential for something far greater. By the early 1950s, as Japan embarked on its journey toward economic resurgence, the stark memories of hunger began to recede, though they never entirely vanished. Adults who had themselves been children during the occupation carried with them the peculiar and indelible image of American servicemen distributing food amidst the ravaged streets. They vividly recalled the sensation of chocolate melting on their tongues, the sticky residue of gum adhering to their fingers, and the comforting warmth of bowls of milk steaming in the winter atmosphere. For many, these recollections existed in an uneasy equilibrium with the traumatic memories of the aerial bombardments. This internal contradiction was something they would grapple with throughout their remaining lives. However, such contradictions can paradoxically serve as bridges. The narrative of Japan and America in the post-war era is not one of simple triumph or unadulterated defeat. It is a complex tapestry woven with paradox, where acts of kindness emerged from the crucible of violence, and the offer of survival came from those who had previously delivered destruction. It is a story demonstrating how children, unburdened by the full weight of nationalistic pride, became the initial emissaries of reconciliation. They tasted the sustenance provided by their conquerors and discovered not monstrous figures, but fellow human beings, not abstract myths, but tangible individuals. And perhaps this is precisely why the memory persists with such potent force, for it serves as a powerful reminder that even in the most profound aftermath of despair, small, deliberate actions can fundamentally alter the trajectory of nations. A single spoonful of milk, a small square of chocolate, a humble piece of bread. These were not merely sources of caloric intake. They were potent symbols, quiet, irrefutable evidence that compassion can indeed find fertile ground in the most unexpected circumstances. The years of occupation eventually concluded. Japan, rising from its ashes, began its remarkable recovery, and the children who had once patiently lined up for bowls of soup eventually matured into adults living within a prosperous and democratic society. Yet, in countless family narratives, passed down through generations like cherished heirlooms, that pivotal moment remains etched in collective memory. The day when the enemy extended a hand of sustenance to their children. It is recalled not as an act of humiliation, but as the profoundly tender and unexpected genesis of something that no one had dared to envision. And if the world has gleaned any enduring lesson from that particular chapter in history, it is this: that at times, the most lasting victories are not achieved through the application of force or the deployment of weaponry, but through acts of kindness measured out in simple spoonfuls.